Hello, welcome to Mike's Mets Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Pashota, and a happy Thursday to you. New York Mets held out and picked up the win 4-3 over the Chicago Cubs last night. Pete Alonso would homer for the fourth time in the series, three games in a row now. Pete is hit, so I'm glad to see Pete is hitting well. He's been basically the lone bright spot of the second half of the New York Mets season, and largely most of their entire season. And that's going to segue perfectly into my theme for today, which is going over the Mets' most disappointing seasons of their franchise career, which is going to be a little bit of a downer, but we're just going to have to deal with that because this whole season's been a downer, and I feel like we're used to it by now. So, I went through the entire franchise history, picking out the seasons where I felt like the fan base was most disappointed. And by disappointed, I mean there was anticipation because of a free agent acquisition, multiple free agent acquisitions in some cases. Maybe there was a championship season, and there was a lot of anticipation about potentially running it back and winning another title. Or maybe there was a pennant win, and the anticipation was, okay, we got to the pennant, we're going to take the championship this year. Or maybe there's just an anticipation about the franchise itself and talented young players all being in their prime and being available to play. For whatever reason, these seasons just all went to hell, and the result of it all was we saw the Mets kind of rack up a lot of disappointment over that season. It's been very much what we've been experiencing in 2023. So I wanted to give my top 8 most disappointing seasons in Met franchise history. So starting off, number 8, I'm going to put the 2007. Sorry, not 2007. 2009 New York Mets season, where, if you might remember, the Mets, after blowing 2 major leads in back-to-back seasons, went looking in that offseason for some help. That season also marked the first season at Citi Field, and there was a lot of anticipation about Citi Field and what the new ballpark was going to be like for the Mets. People knew the dimensions. They were interested to see the layout and how the team was actually going to play at Citi Field. And honestly, Citi Field by itself could be just like considered disappointment that first season, because it was a ballpark constructed almost with little to no real life experience. It was a ballpark that was constructed aesthetically and was like very pleasing aesthetically to the eye. It was a beautiful ballpark. It still is a beautiful ballpark. In my opinion, it's one of like the top 5 ballparks in Major League Baseball today. It is, however, a horrendously designed stadium, just in terms of its complete lack of respect to Met history. It focused much more on Brooklyn Dodger history, which is fine. We all remember the Brooklyn Dodgers. Congratulations, the Dodgers, but you've been gone for many, many years. And for those who were living in Brooklyn at the time, it was nice to kind of wallow in the nostalgia, and I'm sure that was great. For Met fans, however, you're kind of like felt like you're holding a bag here at this point. Like, what exactly is this ballpark? Is this a Brooklyn Dodgers ballpark, or is it a New York Mets ballpark? And putting that aside, the dimensions of the ballpark were insane. It was almost specifically designed to frustrate the Met players, in particular David Wright, who their franchise player saw his power almost exclusively sapped out of Citi Field. There's no denying it. He hit much better at Chase Stadium. He obviously was younger, but was still in the prime of his career and had many, many good years to go before he would eventually get hurt. And it's clear that he playing at Citi Field with their dimensions, the opening season dimensions, it wasn't made for him. He could not hit it the other way because they had extended the right center field. So all of his opposite field home runs they used to hit with a high frequency were gone, and that was it. And Citi Field was just a a train wreck that first year, and the Mets were an absolute horrendous mess that saw a lot of major problems happen. And I'll think back about just a few really bad moments. I remember the Luis Castillo drop, where he dropped the ball in the Subway Series against the New York Yankees. What would have been the final out of that inning, ended up dropping it. The Yankees would score after the dropout and win the game, and that's pretty bad. It's a moment that Met fans would not like to remember. That's probably one of the most embarrassing moments in Castillo's career and Met history, definitely. And the Mets off-season acquisitions that year, which were the big headline one was acquiring Francisco Rodriguez, the closer who had closed many games for the Los Angeles Angels at that time, and was coming off a season where he had saved 62 games, setting the single season record for saves in a single season. And he was an enormous acquisition. He was considered the best closer in baseball. People thought it was a great match. The Mets needed a closer. They needed some late inning bullpen help. K-Rod would not really work out that great for the Mets. He had some decent seasons, but was clearly on the decline, and the Mets kind of looked over the fact that in 2008, his strikeout rate had dropped significantly from his career highs from his previous years in his youth with the Angels. And they were just kind of looking at the headline moment, which was acquiring the single-season save leader. So we get this great closer, who might be the best closer in baseball, but was on the decline at that moment. So they overlooked that. They also acquired JJ. I always mispronounce his last name. Poots, I believe is how you say it. It's not Putz. I believe it's Poots. And acquiring him, he was the closer for the Mariners that year. In 2008, and bringing him in to serve as like the setup man to K-Rod, the Mets thought they had everything worked out. They were like, okay, our 8th and 9th innings are going to be set, and with that, we'll have our season to go, and this will be great. 2009 would turn out really badly for the Mets. They would struggle offensively all season. As I mentioned, David Wright's power was pretty much sapped from the get-go. So they had to deal with that. And then also the pitching staff was pretty horrendous. People were getting hurt. They lost Johan Santana for a majority of the season. They had to start guys like Mike Pelfrey and Leon Hernandez, and it was just a whole mess. You had bad years from John Maine, Alva Perez. It was just a really bad season all around. But one hit that had started with a lot of anticipation for the opening of Citi Field and the off-season acquisitions of Poots and K-Rod, as I mentioned before. So that would go as number 8 in the most disappointing seasons. Number 7, I have 1970. And the 1970 Mets team, pretty forgettable. You won't really be able to say that much about them. Nothing really happened for the Mets. They won 83 games that year. The anticipation was because after 1969, the Miracle Mets, there was a lot of hope surrounding the Mets franchise and what they could do, what they could possibly do. They had won 100 games in '69. They had ran off an amazing second half. They had a young, talented pitching staff led by Tom Seaver and Jerry Koosman. The offense had Cleon Jones, Tommy Agee, Ron Swoboda, Jerry Grody. It felt like a decent group offensively, even though they had not hit well in '69. But they felt with the Mets pitching staff, everything should be okay. The problem was everyone declined across the board. That meant offensively, they actually got better, which is pretty funny. Don Clendenon had a great year in his first full season of the Mets, and even though Agee and Swoboda were not, Agee and Jones were not able to match their success of '69, they were still pretty solid, and they also had good years from a number of other Mets players, Swoboda, Art Shamsky, Wayne Garrett. It was across the board. They had actually improved offensively. So their team OPS jumped from 663 to 703. across the board, so they did much better offensively. The problem was the pitching staff declined measurably. Tom Seaver, while still great, saw a big step off from 69 to 1970. He would get it back later in his career, obviously. He would win 2 more Cy Young Awards, but 1970 was a significantly worse pitcher. The same goes for Jerry Koosman, who had missed a few starts that year also due to injury. And you could say, and then pretty much everybody else declined across the board also. Nolan Ryan would struggle. Gary Gentry would struggle, as well as the entire bullpen. Ron Taylor, who would close the games for the Mets last in '69 and done a good job for them, was pretty bad, as was a lot of the other Met bullpen relievers. So it was a moment where people saw potentially a franchise developing, and after raising the World Series banner in 1970 was a enormous moment, and people thought, okay, with Seaver and with Koosman and with a group that they felt like could potentially take them go forward for the next few years, they could be witnessing a potential dynasty. And never happened, unfortunately. The team never really got out of that year of '69, never reached those heights again. So that was unfortunately that unfortunate experience. There was nothing offensive in the offseason that could have also improved the team. They actually measurably got worse because they had acquired Joe Foy to play third base. Joe Foy was fine. There's really nothing to say about Joe Foy, but the guy that they traded in the Joe Foy trade was Amos Otis, who was future, they would trade him to the Kansas City Royals and would become a Kansas City Royals legend. Now in the Kansas City Royals Hall of Fame, won 3 Gold Gloves, has over 2,000 career base hits. Basically, they would have had a lot more value if they kept Otis around instead of dealing in for Joe Foy. And it was just one of those classic Met trades that just did not work out for them. It worked out very well for the other team. And that's the way it goes, unfortunately. So this was a pretty disappointing season for Mets fans in 1970. Moving on, number 6, we have... My phone is not working. Okay. Number 6, we have the 2002 Mets. And the 2002 team... We'll go into another team, or 2 other teams that had made a lot of off-season headlines and were anticipating free agents being sort of their star, being the way that they would get them forward and potentially win them a title. In 2002, the Mets had won the NL pennant in 2000. 2001 had been a bad season, and honestly, 2001 could probably go on this list, but I feel like 2002 was even more disappointing because of the just a sheer amount of new additions that they had made to the team in 2002. So the Mets acquired Mo Vaughn, Jeremy Burnett, Roberto Alomar, and this was anticipated to be like, okay, we have our team. This is going to be great. We've revamped our offense with Alomar, Burnett, and Vaughn, 3 all-star caliber players who people thought pretty highly of. And I'll say this: there was, on paper, it made sense. Things would not go well along with those players. They would also acquire Roger Cedeno, who they had previously had. They brought back Cedeno. They also brought in for the pitching staff Pedro Estacio and Jeff D'Amico, Sean Estes as well, and reliever Mark Guthrie. And of everybody who they acquired, only Mark Guthrie, you could say, had a good year. And Guthrie was fine. Not fine. He was actually really good. The Mets bullpen in 2002 was actually probably their highlight. Everybody else was terrible. Pedro Estacio, Jeff D'Amico, you won't really recognize those names unless you're like a diehard Met fan, because they were both terrible. But the Mets were kind of hinging a lot of their hopes on both those guys being good rotation pieces and would take them forward. No. It was 2 very bad moves, and bringing those 2 in here. The moves that they made for the offense, Mo Vaughn, I'll say this: he had 26 home runs, he had an 805 OPS, he was fine. Definitely not what they paid for, and his decline after 02 was extremely rapid. So this was like his last good season. And even good is probably like saying something. He could not play first base. He was a terrible first baseman. He was more designed to be a DH. This is why he was playing in the American League. So he, across the board, really hurt the team just by bringing him in. It was a really poorly thought out acquisition to bring Mo Vaughn over to the New York Mets. Roberto Alomar is the tougher one to kind of figure out. Alomar was an all-star, was coming off an amazing year with the Cleveland Indians in 2001. He hit 336 that year. He played 157 games, won a Gold Glove, finished fourth in MVP voting. I mean, you're like, this is like a no-brainer. Bring him in. Bring him over. His decline was so rapid, it's almost unheard. I mean, there's been some like bad acquisitions by the Mets over the years. Guys who they brought in who just did not look like the guy that they paid for the year prior. I mean, the dramatic drop-off for Alomar is amazing. I mean, like 11 home runs, 53 RBIs. He batted .266. It was the worst season of his career. And you're like, what exactly happened in that period of time that could go so poorly for one guy? And it's hard. It's really hard to fathom. He aged like 1,000 years in just like one season, and there's been some guys who've done that before. I've never seen for like a Hall of Fame player who was not that old at that point. He was like 34. And they brought him in. He didn't even win a Gold Glove. I mean, he did nothing for the team. It was insane. So that was probably the hardest one to swallow. Jeremy Burnett's. I mean, I don't know. I don't really know what the Mets were anticipating with Burnett's. I mean, he was just bad across the board. He was never a good player, in my opinion. A lot of cheap power, and hit a lot of home runs for the Brewers, but was not a good player. If he was going to have a bad season, it was going to happen then. So, of course, that season was pretty much cursed across the board in 02. And Roger Staino, I'll just finish this up. Roger Staino, not the guy who stole 60 bases for the Mets in 1999. I mean, this is just a guy who was, bad across the board. I mean, you really can't say anything other than that. And he had a good year the year prior again. In 2001, played pretty well. I mean, he batted .293 that year. I mean, stole 55 bases. He just came to New York, and then I don't know what it was in 2002. It was very similar to 2023, I guess. Something was going on in 2002 in New York where everybody just played badly, and everything did not work out for guys. And the result of it all was the Mets spent like an enormous amount of money in the offseason bringing all these guys in. Nothing really happened. They finished 75 and 86. It was a bad year all around, which would lead to a worse year the following year. And we're just kind of repeating history at this point with the 2023 team. Moving on, number 5, I have the 2016 Mets. And the 2016 Mets are an outlier here. They actually made the postseason as a wild card in 2016. The problem was this team should have been spectacular. In 2015, they had blown everybody away with their performance. The pitching staff looked like a amazing group of young talent with Matt Harvey, Jacob deGrom, and Noah Syndergaard, and Steven Matz, Zach Wheeler, who had not played that year but was going to be back for 2016. So you're like, okay, we got 5 guys here. 5 guys, all of them could throw 95 or higher, and we're just brimming with potential, all young guys, all under 30. And people were just like, yes, this is going to be incredible. We are set. And I remember, because I said the same thing. I was like, 2016, this is the year. 2016, 30 years after 86. It's meant to be. They're going to win a title in 2016 the same way they won in 86. It's going to be this incredible pitching staff, and they're going to lead everything all across the board. It's going to be amazing. They would win 87 games. As I said, they made the postseason. They only lost 3 fewer games in that season. The problem was The pitching staff had little to nothing to do about it because almost everybody was hurt. And yeah, it's really what you got to say there. Matt Harvey got hurt early on the season and pitched terribly, and that was pretty much the end of his career right there. He could not get healthy and was just a frustrating player to watch that year. Steven Matz would also have injury problems. Jacob deGrom would have injury problems, foreshadowing the remainder of his career. They had to lean much more heavily than they thought they would have to on Bartolo Colon, who ended up being I guess you could say like the ace, sort of, de facto, of the Mets rotation. He won 15 games. This is where people fell in love with Bartolo Colon because he kind of led the rotation and with everybody going down or struggling. The breakout star was Noah Syndergaard that year. He went 14-9, 2.60 ERA, 218 Ks. People saw him and they were like, yes, this guy is going to win a Cy Young. Never happened. And this is where you just have to say, yeah, nothing really worked out for that team ever. They just had a lot of problems across the board. And, they would bring guys in. Those guys would struggle. They would get some surprise help out of guys like Seth Lugo and Robert Selman. Urus Familia set the Mets single season save record that year, saved 51 games, but had the reputation of being the guy who just blew it and in the postseason. And the offense was not able to really to get on track. And this team was a good team, not as good as it should have been. And with the problems with the rotation and the eventual knowledge that we now all have of how badly everything worked out for all those Met pitchers, the guys that everyone was like, it's the Braves in '92. I was in they have Maddox, Glavine, and Smoltz and Steve Avery, and they're like, okay, this is their version of it. They have all these guys who are going to be Cy Young contenders every year, and they're going to win 20 games, and they're going to win they're going to win strikeout titles and ERA titles, and you're going to be set. And as it turned out, only one of those guys really ever worked out for them, which was Jacob deGrom. And even his career was kind of a strange moment because there was of all the injuries at the end of it, and it's hard to describe what a disappointment that it is to kind of witness all of that pitching talent and be so excited for it, and to realize it just never worked out for anybody, and it's tough to kind of think about. All right, moving on, we go to number 4, and that's going to be the 2023 New York Mets season, the season we're currently in. And it's a little bit of a cheat to say that this is going to be number 4. Honestly, this could end up being number 1 by the end of the season. We just don't know how it's going to end out. I've said a lot about 2023. I don't think I need to say that much more, other than to say that this was just a cursed season from the get-go, with Edwin Diaz going down before the first pitch had been thrown in opening day, having no closer, having to make moves and adjust. Nothing really happening for them, and the guys that they did have, who were not hurt, all struggling. And there's really no way to say other than it was a colossal disappointment. We've gone from the team that people were like, yes, this is the team of the future. They're going to be a major contender going forward for the next few years. Look at them to be a team that could win the NL East this year. It all fell apart. We've now become giant laughingstocks, and it's a tough feeling. What's one we're used to as Met fans, to be sure, but it's a tough thing to kind of come to that realization of, yeah, this is going to be a season to forget. And I don't really want to talk that much more about 2023 other than to say that, yeah, it's tough to kind of put that all into perspective. Number 3, 1987, and this is 2016, where you're like, this team is actually good. They won 92 games, but coming off of 86, the team that won a franchise high 108 games, In '87, they would have a lot of highlights. Howard Johnson and Darryl Strawberry both going 30-30 that season. Definitely a highlight. Uh, that's really kind of where it ends. This team was, it felt like should have been better. They were victims of there not being a wild card. A lot of teams, fell victim to this in the 80s, 70s, really any time before they introduced the wild card, where you would have a great season. You would win 90 games. You didn't win your division. That was it. Sorry. Like, better luck next year. And this team probably could have done something in the postseason if they had a wild card in that year. They had a good enough rotation. Just a lot of bad things happened. They would lose Bobby Ojeda for most of the season. In his place, they would have to use Rick Aguilera, and then Dwight Gooden missing the beginning of the year due to having to go into a drug rehabilitation program for cocaine, and Ron Darling not having the same season the year before, and the bullpen not pitching quite as well in '87 as they did in '86, and this is a common theme for every one of these teams. It's just that these teams had played great the year prior, not so great the year after. The players just were not able to get it going in that season, and because it happened for a lot of guys, everything kind of just fell apart. And it's one thing to say, like, yeah, you're like, okay, well, that guy had one bad year, it's all right, but to have them all having just like tough seasons. Gary Carter would decline rapidly. He was an MVP candidate in '86, had 220 the next year, and we were like, can we get rid of him? Like, it was amazing how badly he played in '87. Keith Hernandez was great, but Wally Backman was not. They replaced him. The majority of the play time would go to Tim Tuffle going forward, and Tim Tuffle had a great season that year. And that's really just what you have to say at that point. They had traded for Kevin McReynolds. McReynolds was like good, I guess. There's nothing to really say about Kevin McReynolds. I mean, he hit 29 home runs that year, but I don't really know what to say about him other than he was there and he was decent for the team overall. Again, this team won 92 games. You wouldn't think they were a disappointment, but coming off of '86, I mean, this was a dynasty. I mean, this was a team that had the potential to be one. In 1985, they had won 98 games that year and were a huge powerhouse. Didn't make the postseason that year either. It's just a matter of things just not quite working out, and they had other opportunities in '88. '88 seemed like a year that they could potentially win the title that year, and they would just run into a better opponent at that moment, the Los Angeles Dodgers. And '87, you can just chalk it up to just a handful of guys having just worse years, and it all just kind of trickling in and becoming a major issue for the team as the season went on. And maybe in a weaker year, maybe they potentially could get to the championship. Maybe they could win the division. But in that season, the NL East had gotten a lot better, and the Mets had just gotten a little bit worse, and it tipped the scales just enough for the NL East to kind of knock the New York Mets back. And as I said, they would go to the postseason next year, win 100 games that year. In '87, after coming off of '86 and the enormous anticipation of what this great young pitching staff could do and what this lineup could do, these great young players, to settle for a 92-win season and not make the postseason was a pretty colossal disappointment in '87. Moving on, number 2, the 1992 Mets. I've talked about this previously when I was comparing them in a previous episode to the 2023 team, so I won't go too much into the team other than to say that this was a team where, as history has gone through, New York Mets franchise history, they've made bold off-season acquisitions. They acquired the best players, the guys that they thought would help the team the best: Bobby Bonilla, Brett Saberhagen, Vince Coleman. None of these moves worked out, and in some cases detrimentally affected the team's clubhouse culture. There's really nothing to say about that team other than the amount of money that they spent. The salary again was I think $45 million, in 1992. A lot of money at the time to spend on a Major League Baseball team. And basically everything fell through. I've looked through that team. There's really nothing to say in terms of like a highlight. I can't say anything that would be worthy of talking about. They were just a across the board terrible team, and for the amount of money that they spent and the immense anticipation of watching that team, I mean, they really did earn the nickname that they would be monikered with, which was the worst team that money could buy. And the 2023 team probably gives them a run for their money, but it's pretty dispiriting to realize that in that period of time with those players, they couldn't make anything happen for them. And it was, with the benefit of hindsight, you look at it and you're like, obviously none of these moves were going to work out for them well. Like, Bobby Bonilla was not a franchise centerpiece. He was a guy that worked well with Barry Bonds, and that would be his MO for his entire career, is that he needed to be with another person. He couldn't be the number 3 hitter for this team. He was good. He was a solid enough acquisition, but by himself was just you look at him and be like, this guy can't carry this team to anything. He's not Barry Bonds, and that was the problem. He wasn't Barry Bonds, and they would follow his career for the rest of the remainder of his time with the Mets. And Brett Saberhagen had some moments. You know, they traded him probably at his highest value moment in the following years, but there's really nothing to say about Saberhagen in terms of his Met career. He didn't really do that much. But they were bringing in this guy who was a Cy Young winner and should have helped that rotation a lot. They needed a lot of rotation help with, an aging Dwight Gooden at that moment, and Sid Fernandez, and a lot of guys who were just not able to kind of step into that role. And ultimately, that probably hurt the team more than anything. And their biggest problem at that moment was acquiring guys who just were not a fit, and it led to a team winning 72 games. There's a lot of moves here that they made that just didn't work out, and acquiring guys like Vince Coleman. Vince Coleman, was a declining player at that moment. Bringing him in was a bad idea. Not bringing any kind of bullpen help was probably the dumbest thing that they could possibly do in that moment. They would make a move a few years prior, bringing in John Franco, but Franco was out from part of that season, and that really hurt the team's bullpen a lot. And you really can't say anything other than that. I mean, they really just across the board just plummeted from once they realized that they just had no team to kind of play with or play for. It was pretty ugly to watch that 92 team play. I assume I was not really alive at that point. I was only 1 year old, but I've seen clips of the 92 team, and they were pretty bad. Yeah. And finally, number 1, the 2007 Mets, which I kind of hinted at. I was going to talk about them later. The 2007 Mets have the ignominy of being this team that's kind of like a cautionary tale of don't count your chickens. Like, it goes down as one of the worst collapses in Major League history. I don't think it's still the worst one. There's been plenty of really bad ones also that have happened, and people will talk about the 2022 Mets, how they just kind of let the Braves eke back into it in 2022, and then in September, just kind of like blowing series against the Braves, and it was not the same. I mean, people will think about it because it's more recent, but it was not the same. I'm sorry. In 2006, the team had won 97 games. Were a powerhouse offensively. Carlos Beltran, David Wright, Jose Reyes, Carlos Delgado. They were loaded. And in 2007, they had signed Moises Alou, and they had Sean Green returning, and with Beltran, Reyes, and Wright, you had 3 guys all in their prime of their careers who were all-star caliber players. They had Delgado, the veteran cleanup man. The pitching rotation, they were hoping to have a healthy Pedro Martinez that year, as well as Tom Glavine and young guys like John Maine and Oliver Perez that season. The bullpen, you still had Billy Wagner coming back, and there was a lot of expectations that things were going to go well for the team. Nothing would work out well at all. The rotation was a horrible hodgepodge team that saw early successes for John Maine and Oliver Perez, and Maine would really drop off in the second half of the season. Perez, it was kind of a comeback year for Perez, and he ultimately was pretty fine, but Tom Glavine was not. Old age really hit Glavine hard at that moment, and he looked every bit of his 41 years at that moment, and particularly in the end of the season. The bullpen, Billy Wagner was still good. Aaron Heilman and Pedro Feliciano were, still quality relievers, but the rest of the bullpen struggled. Scott Schoenice was terrible. So same for Guillermo Mota and Aaron Seeley. All these guys that they would bring in really would work out very badly for them. Carlos Delgado declined across the board, had a terrible season. It was like the worst year of his career in 2007. Luis Castillo, who they traded for and brought in to replace Jose Valentin, who was terrible. Castillo was fine. He batted .296 for the team, but was ultimately pretty bad. Not bad. He just didn't really do anything for the team that in a measurable way. Paulo Duca declined. Salou, when he was healthy, was good. Batted .341 that year, but was gone half the season. Literally only played 87 games that year. Carlos Beltran had a great year. Not as good as 06, and that was probably part of the problem. Sean Green was fine. He batted .291 that year, but offered no power and was not that good defensively. So you look at it that way. David Wright was fantastic in 2007 and should have won an MVP award had it not been for the insane decline of the Mets. And if the Mets had actually held on and won that division, or even made the postseason, David Wright should have had that MVP that year. He was outstanding, batted .325, went 30-30, had 107 RBIs. I'll pin the biggest issues for that 07 team on Jose Reyes, who was terrible in the final stretch of that season. People thought he had burned himself out late in that year because he was so intent on stealing so many bases. And finished the year with 78. Set the Mets franchise record. It was the most stolen bases by a major league player in over a decade, I believe. And it was people would see that it was hurting him because he was expending so much energy on the base stealing that his bats was measurably worse. He could not hit in that final stretch of that season and really hurt them late. The same goes for Carlos Delgado, who was really horrendous in that final month. Paul Duca, and finally, I'm going to throw a lot of the blame on Tom Glavine, who blew it for the Mets in a bad way. In a moment where the Mets were still just hanging on to the postseason hopes by the barest of margins. They started Glavine against the still Florida Marlins at that time, and Glavine completely shit the bed. And I don't curse that often on this episode, but he did. He shit the bed, and he was terrible, and he really screwed them over, and I'll never forgive him for that. It was the worst start of all time. He got shelled early. He gave them no help at all, no support. He looked like he was about 90 years old coming off the mound, and completely blew for them. And the problem was the Mets pitching rotation was so bad that they had no other better options. They had to keep starting Glavine every time, even though he was clearly done at that point in his career, and he couldn't summon anything in that last moment just to kind of keep them in the hopes of potentially winning the postseason. That season goes down. It's still one of the worst collapses of all time because of they had, with 17 games left to play. Everyone remembers this. 17 games left to play. Up 7 games, and they blew it. And part of the thing is that not just were the Mets losing games, but the Phillies were winning games. And I always say this: a collapse, it takes two teams. It takes the team really screwing it over, and the other team that's apparently unstoppable in that last moment. And it happens so rapidly where when you realize the collapse is happening, you're like, oh my god, like it's like a slow motion car wreck happening right in front of your eyes. Where you're like, oh my god, they're losing their entire lead. Win one game, please, and you win a game, and the Phillies would just win a game also, and then like, there'd be no change in the standings. So there'd be nothing to sort of gain that moment, and then you would lose the next game, and they would win the next game, and it just kept going on like that over and over again, and I just couldn't believe it. I remember that in that moment, I was like, "Oh my god, is this actually happening?" And they at the end of it blew it, and I could not believe that this team was not going to make the postseason after what was such a huge high in 06. 07 and how bad that was will leave a taste in my mouth that I will never get over. That was still bad. It is still terrible. Even 08, when people were like, oh, 08 was also I'm like, that wasn't as bad as 07. 07 was really, really bad. And just remembering that and how bad it was, and how the fact that they had no pitching help. None. And the pitching had gotten dramatically worse. John Maine was also really bad in the second half. It was watching that, you're like, this team was badly constructed. I mean, considering all the talent that they had, and they had a lot, and they still had some good offensive players, they had also a lot of guys who really tanked it for them, and especially in that second half. And it is the danger of acquiring veteran players, even guys who have had a lot of success previously. Sometimes it all just kind of falls apart for them, and that was the end result for that 07 team. A team that will go down in infamy. And a lot of these teams, there was potential. There was certainly potential with a lot of these teams. The end result of it all was, unfortunately, disappointment.
Thank you for listening to the Mike Spence Podcast. Please be sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Finally, please also follow the podcast Twitter, which is Mike Spence Pod, all one word. Appreciate your time and have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Let's go, Mets.